But he was brilliant, and we owe him a debt of gratitude. He was a genius. I mean, I poured through his papers weeks on end trying to understand this man and really what it was all about, what motivated him, what energized him. On pages 950, and of course his most famous statement, and I'm sure most of you have heard it, he just simply talks about how these foolish right-wingers believe that they're communists in the American government. And they thought that the communists were responsible for Eastern Europe going communist, and the communists were responsible for China going communist. And these right-wingers, these foolish petty bourgeois, don't understand. This myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communist Act. In fact, this network, which we shall call the Round Table Group, has no aversion to cooperating with communists, and often it does so. I've studied this for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine his papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. I've objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. On pages 1200 and 1201, he tells you that wars are not fought to win anymore. In fact, Bill Clinton, of course, was a student there in 1966 during the Vietnam War, and Professor Quigley told him the truth. We don't go into wars to win them. We don't go into wars to defeat the enemy. We just go into wars to further our own interests, and we leave the other government intact so we'll have somebody to negotiate with. Is it little wonder that Bill Clinton, understanding what this war in Southeast Asia was totally a phony war, should you be surprised that Bill Clinton didn't want to risk his life fighting in the jungles of Vietnam when he understood the power elite didn't want to win that war? An awful lot of brave men died, but what did they die for? For the limited aims of our power elite. Well, on pages 1247 and 1248, he lays it all out. He says, you know, we have a two-party system. But most people talk about a right and a left, a conservative and a liberal. There's a difference. No, you don't understand. What we need are both political parties just the same. So you can vote one party out as often as you want to. Vote out the rascals, but it doesn't make any difference because the same foreign and domestic policy continues. He had it all laid out in the book. Little wonder the plates of the first half of that book were destroyed. But this is not the first time. I can give you example after example of active suppression of books here within the United States. Well, 1972 came, and a book came out called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and I'm sure most of you have read that. It was written by Larry Abraham and Gary Allen, and this took Professor Quigley's work, and then it sort of put a little twist on it, and part of that was, well, who's really responsible for this are the bankers, and they all have Jewish names, Rothschild, Goldman Sachs, you go down the line. But they never mention any of the other central bankers. The predominant number have nothing to do with being Jewish, but it sort of laid that background for anybody who talked about the conspiracy to say, well, they were anti-Semitic because, you know, and then they talk about the two classes of stock, you know, the A stock and the B stock, and the A stock's all owned by the Europeans, and they're getting all the money from all the interest that we're paying for bonds. And it's a great story, but if you study it, it just isn't true. And then, of course, I think the real crux of the book was that communism is controlled from New York City. And, of course, Nelson Rockefeller had gone to Russia, and they got rid of Khrushchev. The very weekend that he was over there, they got rid of Khrushchev. And you know what that means. And there were a lot of Americans who said, yeah, but it seems logical. I mean, we've financed communism since its very inception, and we have. There's no question. I mean, if you want to go in the background of financing communism, you haven't read Anthony Sutton's 3-parts trilogy on Soviet Western technology and Soviet economic development put out by Hoover Institute. Why, I mean, it's all there. We financed communism from its inception. You get hold of Herbert Hoover's memoirs, and of course he was in charge of relief during immediately after the First World War. 95% of the relief efforts sent to Russia massive amounts of food and medical supplies, and where did they go? To the communists. 5% went to the anti-communists. Now, that's hardly what you would expect if Russia was really a danger to America, and if the Russians were really trying to destroy capitalism, is it? It doesn't really make sense. If you read the biography of General Wrangel, he was the commander of the Army of the South, fighting the communists who were advancing, and he was a white Russian, and the majority of the army didn't want communism. The majority of people in Russia did not want communism. But General Wrangel made one serious mistake, and that is that he allowed himself to become dependent upon the British, and once they controlled the supply lines, they said, you will stop all further resistance, you will retreat to the Black Sea, you will be evacuated, and that's the end. And General Wrangel never understood what was going on, but what he didn't understand was that the English government at that time was totally controlled by Lord Milner and his people. Because in 1916, when Lloyd George was elected the Prime Minister of England, replacing the initial Asquith, who was the initial Prime Minister, got England into the war, and the English people wanted to get out of the war. What they didn't understand is that Lloyd George had a secretariat, and 4 of the 6 members of that secretariat just happened to come from the 20 or 30 people that were in the round table. And there was a war cabinet. Who was on the war cabinet? Why, Lord Milner and 2 other men. But the entire staff of the war cabinet, 2 of them were selected by Milner and 2 were selected by Lord Esher, or who was Brett, who was one of the 3 original members of the secret society. And of course, there was Brett, there was Lord Esher advising the King of England. It was all controlled, it was all contrived, and they fought 4 bloody years for a war that was fought simply to destroy the infrastructure of Europe, so that they could bring in the League of Nations and a new world government. And if you want to challenge that, we can give you some of the documentation on it. Well, anyway, this is an amazing, amazing story that Professor Quigley laid out in Tragedy and Hope. But the question was, how did he know it? I mean, if you read Tragedy and Hope, there's not one footnote. Not one. So, 1980, I decided I was going to find out what the basis of this was, and I went back to Georgetown, and I spent several weeks going through his files, and that's where I found the tape that we have, a taped interview with Professor Quigley where he tells you the story about how his publisher destroyed the plates in the first half of his book, and then he talks about the symbol on the back of the dollar bill, the occult symbol, and he says, you know, these crazy right-wingers, they're coming to me and they're telling me that that's the symbol of the Illuminati. He said, that isn't the symbol of the Illuminati. That symbol goes back 5,000 or 6,000 years. That symbol has been used in pagan and ancient and mystery religions for 5,000 years. And most people don't know that. Most people don't know where that symbol comes from and why it's significant that on the back of the American dollar bill, this symbol exists. Well, anyway, I went to Quigley's papers. And of course, how he found out about the secret society. I mean, how do you find out about a secret society when everybody's sworn to secrecy? Well, one man, in fact, there were 3 men who told us the story, or told him the story. 2 men told him the story. One, a man we've tracked down on our own. And the first was Professor Zimmern. And about 1946-47, Quigley was over in Europe studying the power structure of Great Britain, and he came across a man named Alfred Zimmern. He was a professor, and Alfred Zimmern told him that he had belonged to a secret society between 1910 and 1922. Now, if you read the book that was published the following year, The Anglo-American Establishment, we have it back there, Professor Quigley will tell you that the only way he could write about the secret society is because he knew somebody on the inside, but he never tells you who it was. The reason I know who it was is because I've got all of his papers. I copied them. Cost a fortune, but we've got volumes and volumes of these papers. All of his letters to Zimmern where they're trying to calculate who was in the secret society when it was first formed. And the letters from Zimmern to Quigley and Quigley to Zimmern. So Zimmern is the one who told him about it in the book, The Anglo-American Establishment. Quigley says that Zimmern was in the secret society between 1910 and 1922. And the reason that Zimmern got out was, I mean, he was an idealist. He went into the secret society. He believed in the First World War. It was to change the world. It was to defeat the Germans. And, of course, the French were their allies. The Germans were the enemy. And he could go along with all the carnage and the horror of the war, although I'm sure it must have bothered him somewhat. It would bother any moral individual when you realize that there were about 21 million people killed, about 7.5 million soldiers and about 12.5 million